Two women vanished into the same city within 2 years of each other, Los Angeles, late 1940s. One left behind a purse with a note that said Kirk. The other was beaten to death and left with a message written in red lipstick. History keeps trying to turn them into symbols. Hollywood keeps trying to turn them into myths. And true crime keeps trying to stitch them together, whether the facts allow it or not. Spangler didn't disappear into glamour. French didn't die for a headline. But both were buried under speculation while the truth was ignored. Tonight, we're stripping away the rumors, the lazy connections, and the recycled lies, and telling these two stories the way they should have been told from the start. This is Deadly Truth with Becca. Before she became a headline, Spangler was a young woman trying to survive Hollywood without the protection people like to imagine came with it. She was 26 years old, a dancer first, an actress second. She wasn't a star. She worked bit parts, chorus lines, small roles that paid just enough to keep going and never enough to feel secure. The kind of work where you're replaceable by tomorrow and expected to smile anyway. She was also a single mother to a 5-year-old daughter. That part of her life rarely makes the headlines, but it defined her reality. Every decision she made was filtered through money, childcare, and survival, not glamour. Her career was stalled, and like many women in late 1940s, Hollywood, she lived in a world where doctors operated in shadows and mistakes followed you forever. On the night she disappeared, she told her sister she was meeting her ex-husband to discuss child support, a mundane adult problem. She dressed normally, she took her purse, she planned to come home. Days later, that purse turned up in Griffith Park. Inside was the note everyone obsesses over, the one with the name Kirk. The note wasn't dramatic, it wasn't threatening, it sounded resigned, practical, like someone trying to manage a problem quietly without alarming anyone. That matters, because people love to paint Spangler as reckless or secretive. But nothing about her last known actions suggests a woman chasing danger. They suggest a woman handling something personal in a time when women didn't have safe options. Jeanne Spangler didn't vanish into mystery. She vanished into silence, the kind that swallowed women who couldn't afford mistakes, publicity, or help. And whatever happened to her, the most honest thing we can say is this: she wasn't a symbol, she wasn't a clue. She was a mother who didn't come home. The name Kirk in Spangler's purse has fueled decades of speculation, and most of it is lazy. There is no evidence the note referred to Kirk Douglas. None. He cooperated with police. He had an alibi. He was never a suspect. The fixation happened for one reason only: fame. Kirk is a common name. The note was incomplete, and the media chose the most recognizable Kirk in Hollywood because it sold papers, not because it fit the facts. What the note actually shows is something far less movie-like. A woman trying to handle a private problem quietly in an era where privacy was survival. Turning that into a celebrity conspiracy didn't solve her disappearance. It just erased her humanity. Spangler's story ends in silence. No body, no answers, just a purse left behind. Jeanne French's story is the opposite. Her body was found, her injuries were documented, and the message left behind was misread, misreported, and turned into something it never was. Same city, same decade. Two women failed in very different ways and remembered for all the wrong reasons. Both women were named Jeanne, spelled differently, lived differently, remembered differently. To avoid confusion, from here on, I'll refer to Jeanne French simply as French. Before she became a photograph in a police file, French was a middle-aged woman living an ordinary, constrained life in post-war Los Angeles, and that ordinariness is exactly why she was forgotten. French was 44 years old, divorced, working class, not young enough to swoon over in Hollywood fashion, not famous enough to protect. She lived alone and worked clerical and office jobs, the kind of work that kept women afloat but invisible. She didn't move in Hollywood circles. She wasn't chasing stardom. Her life was structured around routines, work days, errands, evenings that didn't make the papers. And in 1947, Being a divorced woman carried weight. It meant financial strain, social judgment, fewer safety nets. You didn't call the police unless you had to. You didn't draw attention to yourself. You handled problems quietly, or you paid for it. People like to imagine French as reckless or involved in something dangerous because of how she died, but nothing in her background suggests that. There's no record of criminal activity, no history of high-risk behavior, no evidence she was living on the edge. She was living a calm and relatively mundane life by most reports. That's important because when violence happened to women like French, it wasn't treated as a rupture. It was treated as an inconvenience, something unfortunate, something that didn't demand obsession or outrage. French wasn't a mystery woman. She wasn't a symbol. She was a person whose life didn't come with a press kit. And that's why when she was killed, the story became about the spectacle, not about who she was or what she lost. It's easy to blur these women together because history did, but when you slow down, really slow down, Spangler and French lived in the same city while occupying very different social worlds, and that distinction matters. Spangler was 26 years old. She was an actress and a dancer, not famous, not inaccessible, just close enough to Hollywood for people to project stories onto her. She was a single mother, financially unstable, her career uncertain, and when she vanished completely. No body, no crime scene, just absence. French was 44. She worked clerical jobs. She was divorced, living alone, and entirely outside the Hollywood machine. Her life was structured, routine-driven, and invisible. And when violence came to her, it was unmistakable. She was found. Her injuries were documented. Her death was undeniable. Both women were navigating post-war Los Angeles, a city overwhelmed by returning servicemen, housing shortages, informal economies, and almost no real protections for women living on the margins. And both were living without protection. No powerful families, no institutional safety net, no social leverage when something went wrong. That's the similarity. The difference is how the world reacted. Spangler's proximity to Hollywood made her disappearance louder than it should have been, but also more distorted. Almost immediately, her story turned speculative. Names were floated, motives invented. Her life became a puzzle for the public to solve. French's lack of visibility did the opposite. Her murder was brutal and well documented, and then quietly discarded once it stopped generating headlines. One was mythologized, the other was minimized. And this is where the timeline matters. On January 15, 1947, Elizabeth Short is found murdered. On February 10, 1947, French is found beaten to death. On October 7, 1949, Spangler disappears. French's murder happens weeks after Elizabeth Short. Spangler disappears nearly 3 years later. Yet all three women keep getting grouped together. Why? Because the Black Dahlia case became a kind of cultural gravity well. Everything nearby gets pulled into it, whether the facts support it or not. French was linked because of misreported lipstick writing. Spangler was linked because of Hollywood proximity. Neither connection holds up under scrutiny. What the timeline actually shows is this. French's murder belongs to early 1947, a moment of heightened media panic and sensational crime reporting. Spangler's disappearance belongs to late 1949, a quieter period where private crises didn't trigger the same investigative urgency. Elizabeth Short's case sits between them not as a connector, but as a distortion lens. These women weren't part of one story. They were victims of the same city, the same era, and the same systemic failures, but not the same crime. When you collapse them into a single narrative, you erase the truth. Different risks, different forms of violence, different investigative failures. What links them isn't a killer. It's how quickly lives were rewritten once they could no longer speak for themselves. Let's step out of rumor and into documentation. Police files, coroner reports, timelines, and what investigators actually recorded. Because when you do that, the connective tissue people want between Elizabeth Short, French, and Spangler falls apart fast. Here's what the historical record shows. Elizabeth Short's murder was highly controlled. Her body was deliberately placed, surgically altered, and carefully posed. Investigators noted planning, precision, and post-mortem manipulation. Whether the killer had medical knowledge is debated, but the level of control is not. French's murder looks nothing like that. French was beaten, stomped, and left where she fell. The violence was chaotic, rage-driven, and immediate. There was no surgical precision, no body staging meant to be displayed. The lipstick message, long sensationalized, was likely misread from the start. Original documentation points to PD, not BD, meaning police, not Dahlia. That alone removes the strongest supposed link. And then there's Spangler, who doesn't belong in a homicide comparison at all. There is no confirmed crime scene, no remains, no cause of death. Her case is classified as a disappearance. Everything attached to it, the note, the purse, the speculation, is circumstantial. You cannot link modus operandi when there is no proven crime. Chronology reinforces this separation. French is killed weeks after Short. Spangler disappears nearly 3 years later. Serial offenders, when they escalate or repeat, show continuity, geography, victim type, method, or signature. None of that holds here. Different ages, different lifestyles, different types of violence, different investigative categories. The only thing these cases truly share is Los Angeles and a media culture primed to connect dots, whether they exist or not. Historically, these women were bundled together because it made the chaos feel orderly, because one killer feels easier than many failures, because mythology travels farther than paperwork, but the paperwork doesn't support it. No shared suspect has been credibly established across all three. No forensic linkage has ever been proven. No official investigative body concluded they were related. What history shows instead is something quieter and more uncomfortable. 3 women harmed in different ways. 3 investigations shaped by visibility and bias. And 3 stories flattened by the same urge to turn women into symbols instead of people. They aren't linked by a killer. They're linked by how quickly speculation replaced patience and how easily fact was sacrificed for narrative. That's what the record says. Whenever a woman is killed or disappears, history asks the same question first. Was it the husband? Sometimes that question is justified. In these 2 cases, the documentation gives us very different answers and no smoking gun. Let's start with Spangler. Jeanne was divorced at the time she disappeared. Her ex-husband was Dexter Benner, and according to police records, she was supposed to meet him the night she vanished to talk about child support. That fact alone made him an obvious early person of interest. Police questioned him. They checked his movements, and they did what they could with the evidence they had. There was no physical evidence tying him to her disappearance. No blood, no witnesses, no confirmed crime scene. Without a body, there was nothing to prosecute and nothing solid to hold on to. He remained part of the timeline but never became a viable suspect. Now French. She was also divorced, but her situation looked very different. She lived alone. Her ex-husband was not present in her daily life in any documented way, and there's no indication of recent contact tied to the night she was killed. More importantly, French's murder was overtly violent. A beating so severe it points toward a confrontation that escalated rapidly, not a planned domestic crime hidden behind closed doors. There's no documented history of domestic violence tied to her ex-husband, and no evidence placing him at or near the scene. In both cases, investigators looked where they were supposed to look, and in both cases, the husband, or ex-husband, theory didn't hold up under scrutiny. That doesn't mean these men were saints. It doesn't mean the relationships were easy. It means the evidence never crossed the line from possible to provable. For Spangler, the tragedy is that without a body, suspicion lingered without resolution. For French, the tragedy is that even with a body, the investigation stalled once the obvious angles ran dry. In neither case does the historical record support a husband or ex-husband as the most likely explanation. What it supports instead is something harder to accept. These women were harmed in a system that ran out of answers long before it ran out of rumors. If we're going to be honest about these cases, we have to move past the usual suspects and talk about access. Not who sounds dramatic, who could actually get close enough for harm to happen. Let's start with Spangler. Jeanne lived a life that required trust. As an actress and dancer working the margins of Hollywood, she moved through informal networks. Agents, casting contacts, acquaintances, men who offered help, rides, introductions, or money. That was normal in 1949. It was also risky. Anyone who had access to Jeanne would have been someone she didn't fear, someone she would meet willingly, someone who could persuade her to leave without raising alarms. That points away from a random predator and toward a known contact, not necessarily famous, not necessarily powerful, but familiar enough to feel safe. There's also the medical angle. If the note refers to a doctor, legitimate or not, that introduces an entirely different access point. Medical providers operating quietly outside the law had private spaces, authority, and discretion. If something went wrong, it wouldn't have looked like a crime until it was far too late. Now, French? She lived differently, but her vulnerability was just as real. French worked clerical jobs. She kept routines. She lived alone. That meant the people with access to her were those in her daily orbit. Co-workers, neighbors, casual acquaintances, someone she encountered repeatedly enough to feel ordinary. Her murder shows signs of rage and immediacy, not long-term planning. That points to someone who confronted her directly, someone who didn't need to lure her far or hide the interaction, someone whose access came from proximity, not persuasion. Importantly, French's injuries don't suggest a stranger attack in the traditional sense, not opportunistic, not fleeting. They suggest escalation, a conflict that turned violent. That kind of access usually comes from familiarity, not anonymity. In both cases, the strongest common thread is situational access, not a shared offender. Spangler's risk came from trust and invisibility, being young, female, and expected to navigate problems quietly. French's risk came from routine and exposure, being alone, predictable, and unprotected. Different pathways, different dangers. What access does not support is a roaming serial offender linking these cases across years, methods, and victim profiles. There's no continuity of behavior, no consistent victim type, no shared signature. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Serial killer theories don't survive because they're accurate. They survive because they're emotionally efficient. One killer feels easier than many failures. One explanation feels cleaner than 3 broken investigations. When cases like Spangler's and French's go unsolved, the public doesn't just want answers. It wants order, a pattern, a through line, something that turns chaos into a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's where serial killer logic slips in. Different women, different lives, different forms of violence, but the same city, the same decade, and the same unresolved frustration. And suddenly people start forcing connections that the evidence never made. Another reason these theories persist is media inheritance. Once a high-profile case like Elizabeth Short enters the cultural bloodstream, everything nearby gets compared to it. Investigators move on, reporters retire, but headlines live forever. And later writers reuse them without rechecking the original documentation. Then there's the darker reason. Serial killer narratives shift responsibility. If one man did everything, then the police didn't miss multiple suspects. Society didn't fail. The system didn't repeatedly drop the ball. Blame gets concentrated instead of distributed. But when you actually look at the records, that story collapses. Spangler's case lacks the basic elements required to compare methods at all. No body, no cause of death, no confirmed crime scene. French's murder shows spontaneous, rage-driven violence, not repetition, not ritual, not escalation. And Short's murder stands alone in its level of control and staging. These are not echoes of the same hand. They are different failures wearing the same decade. Serial killer theories feel satisfying because they promise closure. But in cases like these, they do the opposite. They flatten lives, blur accountability, and replace patience with spectacle. The truth is harder to sit with. Sometimes there isn't one monster. Sometimes there are just gaps in protection, in urgency, and in whose lives were considered worth solving. And that's not a mystery. That's history. If you spend any time around these cases, one name keeps resurfacing: George Hodel. And it's not because the evidence suddenly got stronger. It's because his story sits at the crossroads of fear, access, and unfinished business. Here's why Hodel keeps getting pulled into conversations about Elizabeth Short, and why that spillover reaches Jeanne Spangler, even when it shouldn't. First, Hodel was real. He wasn't a tabloid invention. He was a licensed physician in Los Angeles. He moved in elite circles. He had money, power, and privacy, 3 things that make people uneasy when murders go unsolved. Second, he became central to the Black Dahlia story because of who accused him: his own son, a former LAPD detective. That gave the theory institutional weight it otherwise wouldn't have had. Wiretap recordings, disturbing statements, circumstantial overlaps. All of that lives in a gray zone where suspicion feels justified even when proof isn't conclusive. So once Hodel became the suspect for Elizabeth Short, he became something else too. A template, a doctor, a man with access to women in crisis, a man with private spaces and authority. And once you have that template, it's tempting to apply it everywhere. That's how Jeanne Spangler gets pulled in. Spangler's note mentions a doctor. Her disappearance suggests a private appointment. People connect those dots and ask what kind of man would have access, discretion, and control. And suddenly Hodel's name reappears, not because the records tie him to Spangler, but because he fits the idea people already built. Here's the hard truth. There is no direct evidence placing George Hodel and Jeanne Spangler's disappearance. No witness, no document, no confirmed interaction. What links him to Spangler is the absence of answers, not the presence of proof. Hodel stays in these conversations because he represents something broader: the fear that powerful men could harm women and disappear behind status, institutions, and time. That fear isn't irrational, but fear is not evidence. Historically, Hodel belongs, if anywhere, in the Elizabeth Short discussion, and even there, his guilt remains unproven. Pulling him into Spangler's case doesn't clarify the mystery, it muddies it. And when one suspect starts swallowing multiple victims without documentation, that's not investigation anymore. That's myth building. What history actually asks us to do here is hold separate cases apart, accept separate failures, and resist the urge to solve discomfort by recycling the same villain. Because one name doesn't explain 3 women, and pretending it does only guarantees we'll keep misunderstanding all of them. French didn't vanish into rumor. She was found, she was seen, and she was still ignored. Someone beat her to death and walked away, not because they were brilliant, but because no one kept looking once the headlines moved on. That's the part that should unsettle you, because whatever happened to French didn't require a monster hiding in the shadows. It required time and silence, and Los Angeles gave both. French's killer didn't need to be clever. They didn't need a plan that lasted years. They just needed to know one thing: that once French was dead, the world would lose interest. And they were right. That's not a mystery. That's a warning. French's body was left in the open. Her injuries were documented. The message on her skin was misread and then forgotten, which means someone learned a lesson that night: not how to kill, but how easily it could be done without consequences. And that should bother you far more than any theory ever will. Spangler and French never met. They didn't move in the same circles. They didn't die the same way. And that's the point. One disappeared quietly, carrying a problem she was trying to solve without disturbing anyone. The other was killed brutally, in the open, Her body turned into a message no one bothered to read correctly. Different endings, same outcome. Both women were reduced, not by what happened to them, but by what came after. Speculation instead of protection, narrative instead of patience, silence instead of accountability. Spangler became a question mark people felt entitled to fill in. French became a crime scene people felt free to forget. Neither was allowed to remain fully human once they could no longer speak. And when you strip away the theories, the celebrity names, the recycled suspects, what you're left with isn't a shared killer, it's a shared failure. A system that moved on too quickly, and a public more comfortable with myths than with unfinished truths. Spangler and French don't belong together because they were killed by the same person. They belong together because history treated them the same way once they were gone. And that's the part we're still repeating. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. These stories don't end cleanly. They don't offer villains tied up with evidence or answers that feel safe. What they offer is something harder, a record of who was failed and how easily the truth can be bent once the people at the center are gone. If you want more fact-driven, victim-first history, follow, rate, and share the show. It's how these stories stay documented instead of disappearing, because the past isn't dead. It's just doing time in the silence we leave behind.